Hello and welcome, everyone. I am MangaKamen and welcome to a new series, to the Game Chain, where we look at games in a series to compare and contrast different installments to see how the later entries actually hold up to the original and... Oh, so you're blatantly ripping off Sequelitis. Good to know. Alright, before you guys go down and below the comments section, I am well aware that I am doing a copy of the idea of sequelitis, but considering that the original series is dead for 2 years, someone's gotta try to fill in those shoes. So we're starting off strong with the first 2 generations of one of the biggest gaming franchises of all time, Pokemon. So, what are you doing?
I am just warming up my comrades defending the first generation!
But I like all the generations of Pokemon, and I'm not going to bash
Gen 1 is the best Gen! I want to rub just mine!
Look, if you think Generation 1 is the best, good on ya! If you like different generations, also good on ya! This video is not meant to bash whatever you like in the Pokemon universe. It's just taking a look at the games and seeing what makes them shine and what doesn't. And our goal is to be as objective as possible, but I can't promise that it'll be completely objective. So let's talk about Generation 1. Now, for the time, the game was pretty simple, at first glance. So, you started as a kid playing his Nintendo system, and people got on modern games for product placement. Ugh. When you decide to escape from your mom, who only seems to be able to say 3 lines of dialogue to you, there's not much to go around in the town of Pallet, so you'll be like, screw this backwater town, and head through the grass. So meet Professor Oak, the guy who will give you your very first Pokemon, and for a lot of people, the first Pokemon they'll ever have. Bulbasaur, Charmander, and Squirtle. And after you make one of the toughest choices of your little kid life, your journey will begin. Now let's take a moment to talk about the starters, since it's a theme that goes on pretty much every game. A grass, a fire, or a water type Pokemon. Back in the day, this was the hard choice, since in Generation 1 you could only get one starter. At least until Pokemon Yellow appeared, and choosing your starter was a very important choice in the games. Of course, no matter which starter you chose, your rival would always get the one that had the type advantage. You wanted to be the awesome lizard with fire on its tail? He'd get the water turtle. You wanted the awesome turtle? He'd get the frog with a plant on its back. You want Bulbasaur? Well, let's be honest, no one picked Bulbasaur. And with that, your adventure began. Well, until the old man blocks your way.
Hey, get off my yard!
Needs his coffee, my foot. In the original, the old man was drunk. Well, enough fluff, let's get talking about the gameplay. Considering the fact that the main line of Pokemon games are turn-based RPGs, the learning curve for how to control your Pokemon is relatively simple. Basic overworld controls are simple enough. You control the character with up, down, left, and right, and can interact with people, signs, and items that you find. And this sort of gameplay is easy to understand within the first few minutes of gameplay, and since there's no real penalty for experimentation, the player can get used to the controls of controlling the player character. It's not like there aren't any traps or anything, considering that this is a game series for kids. It's not like we're playing Lisa the Painful here, where you take a step off a ledge, you'll take damage. Note to self, talk about Lisa sometime. The complexity of the game comes more in the battle system, and in the original games you get the first battle against your rival. Oh, right, I suppose we should name him. Now, when you start your battle, you're given 4 choices. To fight, to use an item, to change your Pokemon, or to run. And unless you got the potion from your PC box at the beginning of the game, you're pretty much limited to only one option in those 4, to attack. It's pretty simple stuff. After all, the demographic is for kids. We also get to see that players will have access to 4 moves. Eventually, depending on your starter, you're only given 2 basic moves from the selection of Scratch, Tackle, Growl, and Tail Whip. So we're not given a chase of the elemental aspects of the game yet, but what we are given is the stat changes, with Growl and Tail Whip affecting attack and defense respectively. It gives the player a chance to see there's more to the combat than just selecting a super effective move. That there are moves in the game that can act as buffers and debuffers, and that can affect the damage output in the fights. Although, to be honest, when I first saw the move Tail Whip, I was expecting a damaging move, not a debuffer. Use Tail Whip! Huh, I was kind of expecting something to... But yes, the first battle allows you to wet your feet with more complex battle mechanics with stat decreases. And hey, the worst thing you get is if you lose is... Smell you later! Eventually you're allowed to jump back into the world and face off against some wild Pokemon. And with a very small amount of backtracking, you're ready to leave Viridian City.
Hey, whippersnapper! You wanna learn how to catch a Pokemon?
Oh, for the love of... Alright, tangent time! Now, when it comes to tutorials, I'm a mixed bag with them. The player does need to be able to understand the basic mechanics and how key features of the game will work. Now, it depends on the game. The tutorials can be good or egregious. For Pokemon, well, in the first generation, it was kind of neat to learn how to add more Pokemon members to your team. After all, most who played these games when they were first released were roughly around 10 years or younger, whereas most of the time in RPGs up to that point, you get your team after a certain event. But oh my Arceus, Game Freak! I doubt anyone affiliated with them will see this, but seriously, you need to be able to make tutorials skippable. Especially since nowadays your main audience is adults, who have more than likely played a previous generation. It's been 20 years, why can we not have this option? Seriously, after the 16th time I played these games, I get it. Open the bag, select the Pokeball, and vigorously hold the B button for luck to catch that damn Pikachu. Damn you, Nintendo! Damn you, Game Freak! Damn you, you stupid clerk who wouldn't get my turkey sandwich right now! Rant over. Now, by this point in time, people are aware of the formula of Pokemon. Travel the region, catch the Pokemon, battle the 8 gyms, and then challenge the Elite Four. All the while you're leveling up your Pokemon and catching new ones. Now, let's take a moment to talk about the gyms. In the first generation, the gyms had a bit of a connection with the starters. Selecting the starter was basically choosing the mode for the game. If you chose Squirtle or Bulbasaur, you had the medium and the easy settings respectively. This is due to the typings of the very first 2 gyms, Rock and Water, both of which have neutral or disadvantage to those starters. By the time you reach the first gym, your starter Pokemon had its first elemental attack, Bullet for Squirtle and Leech Seed for Bulbasaur, both of which can easily affect your challenge at the first gym. But Charmander? Due to it being a fire type, its Ember attack will do minimal damage against Brock's rock and ground type Pokemon. Yes, none of its Pokemon in the first generation have moves that can really hurt you with super effective damage, but you would be in for a really long battle. Now this is where 2 more aspects of Pokemon come into play, type advantaging and Pokemon flexibility. One of the more important aspects of Pokemon at this juncture was typing, and the first gym gives you a good idea how typing works. Since your normal attacks of your starter won't do a lot of damage against Brock's highly defensive rock types, you'd have to rely on other moves. And as I said, at this point, after you've battled a few Pokemon and get some trainers in the Viridian Forest, you'll have access to another move. And depending on your starter, this move will give you a positive or negative encounter with its type. The other aspect? Pokemon flexibility. Even if you chose Charmander, or if we're talking about Pokemon Yellow, the games do give you options to cover up type disadvantage you may come across in your journey. Let's say you chose Charmander, and why you would choose Charmander is beyond me, because long live Team Squirtle! Where'd that flag come from? If you chose Charmander, the games would give you the option to combat Brock with his long, hard, and oddly flexible rock snake. That comes in the form of Caterpie. I'm not gonna lie, the Caterpie line is really not the best line for late game, but for early game, for all the saps who chose Charmander, this little bug can be quite the lifesaver, and that's because of Butterfree. If you manage to get your Caterpie to evolve into a Metapod and then to a Butterfree, which is a relatively easy thing to do since the line evolves so quickly, you'll get access to another move, Confusion, and thanks to this move, Brock's Pokemon can't do anything to protect themselves from it. And this is prevalent in the games and other points. Misty's water types, you can get access to Oddish and Bellsprout. Lieutenant Surge's electric types, Diglett Cave. Erica's grass Pokemon, you can get a Vulpix or Growlithe depending on the version. Now one could easily make the argument that this makes the game easier, and I won't deny that fact at all. But that's kind of the point. The game is giving you the tools you need in order to win. But with every positive, there is a negative. With every up, there is a down. So too does that apply to the Pokemon original generation. Thank you, denizens of the internet. You made this job really so easy.
I've seen this surface many times, and it blows my mind how people say, yep, see, first generation, worst generation, because of all these. If you read these are game glitches.
Oh! No, they aren't all glitches, and just saying that these are glitches is a dishonest and stupid manner. There are glitches among this list of problems, don't get me wrong, but they are mentioned and differentiated from the actual problems. For example... Snake! Yes, there are a number of problems with the first generation, and two of the most prominent are the Psychic and Special Stat, which went hand in hand. And one have more than likely heard about it from pretty much every PokeTuber under the sun, so I'll sum this up real quick. Thanks to the Psychic typing and the Special Stat being a mixed bag, along with the fact that any elemental moves like Water or Fire types were considered special attacks, the Special Stat would be able to cover both special attacks and defense. One of the worst Pokemon to abuse this in the game would have to be Lorelai's Slowbro. with it having the move Amnesia, as it would boost its special stat greatly, and considering the 2 out of the 3 weaknesses were all special moves, electric and grass moves, and the third type being Bug, which only had 3 moves back in that generation, and all 3 were extremely weak. And then there's the walking speed of the games in the overworld. Until you get the bike in the game, you'll be going at a snail's pace. Heck, I was glad when Pokemon Stadium had a feature that allowed you to play the Pokemon games on your television, but also allowed you to access the Doduo and Dodrio Tower that allowed you to play the games at faster speeds. But another tangent, Game Freak! Why didn't you include that in the digital remakes of the Generation 1 games? It would have made playing the games a lot more fun and easier! Why do you hate me? So yeah, those are some of the flaws in Generation 1. But for what it was, the games are still a classic. And then came something that appeared. Something that drew the attention of every player of that game. Generation 2. Praise be to this generation! The second generation brought a lot to the table. And if we had Crystal, we got something that was new. You could play as a girl. Took a while for that to happen, and it had to be in the third game of the generation, but we'll probably talk about that in a future vid. So for now, let's talk about the upgrades to the gameplay. One of the first things you'll notice once you start the game is that it'll ask for the time. That's because the games now have a day and night feature, which is actually pretty awesome. It makes the Pokemon world seem a bit more real and adds a few more subtle changes to the gameplay. Depending on the time of the day, you'll encounter different Pokemon, or some Pokemon will evolve at different points in time, like Eevee will get 2 new evolutions. It's a subtle addition, but an addition that adds a lot to the world of Pokemon. Speaking of changes, I'd be remiss to add a few of the balances to the combat system, the biggest being that the addition of the Dark and Steel types. Both of these types had an advantage over the Psychic typing, with Dark-type Pokemon being immune to Psychics and super effective against the type, while Steel had a resistance to Psychic-type Pokemon attacks. This also allowed the fighting type to become a bit more balanced as well, since both types were weak to it. There was also the fix to the Ghost types as well, which actually made it useful against Psychic typings. And another thing that was fixed in the original games? There was a special stat being split. Bless Lugia and Ho-Oh, for they are our savior! No longer would you have to worry about the special buffs. This fixed the issue and made the combat a lot more balanced. Another aspect of the battling was the held items. Now, depending on the held item, your Pokemon's attacks would increase, such as using a charcoal to bolster fire attacks, or giving your Pokemon a berry in order to heal them. Other features that were brought into the game were breeding, shiny Pokemon, and Pokerus. Along with breeding came Pokemon genders, which allowed you to breed your Pokemon so long as they were in the same egg group, then
Don't let your kids what's it?
breeding would allow you to get new moves, new Pokemon, and down the line new abilities and such. It is a fun little mechanic that is still with the games even to this day. The other two, Shiny Pokemon and Pokerus, are a little different. Shiny Pokemon were introduced into the games, and although they don't really add anything other than a static value, it's always nice to see a different colored version of your favorite Pokemon appear before you and
Hacks.
excuse me?
Chinese used in competitive playing are hacked.
Good for you, no one cares.
But what about hacking and
Bubsy, 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 Bobcat!
But the other introduction is the Pokerus concept. Like shiny Pokemon, you have a small chance of catching a wild Pokemon that has a surprisingly good virus. It's a 1 in 21,845 chance, but it's still a thing to consider. Why? Because it can double your effort values when your Pokemon has Pokerus.
But you didn't explain what effort values are.
I was just about to get to that! Effort values, or EVs as they were calling them, are something that to be shared in both generations. However, one thing to note is that this is something that has changed since then the third generation, and we'll talk about that into more effort values when we get to that comparison. What you need to know now is that during the first and second generation, EVs were used to improve a Pokemon's stats and could reach up to 65,535 in each of their stat totals. There's one more thing I have to say about Generation 2. It was a continuation of Generation 1. These have got to be some of the longest Pokemon games around, especially since you can travel towards the previous region, fight the previous 8 gyms, and even fight against the previous player character, Red. These games really built upon the original games and actually improved the formula. That being said, there are faults in Generation 2 that I can't in good conscience ignore. One of the biggest problems? You were still slow!
Hey! A ghost ride the wind!
The fact that these games where, until you had the bike, you're stuck at one speed is why you would rather play the remakes. There's also the original Pokeballs, which the idea is great, in how over the years they actually fixed things, they were just as tedious, since it takes 24 hours just to make one. Not to mention, there was a glitch that made a couple of the balls not work. For example, the Moon Ball. Instead of catching a Pokemon who was evolved with a Moonstone, it caught Pokemon who were evolved with a Burn Heal. Why? There's also roaming Pokemon. One of the worst Pokemon in Generation 1 to catch was Abra, since it had the move Teleport. And back in the original games, if you were able to get an Alakazam, that would be an awesome Pokemon to have on your team. But here, we've got 3 roaming legendaries, Entei, Raikou, and Suicune. And while you can see them once and follow them with your Pokedex, if you find their location, they will run away to another. So you have to walk or bike to their current location. What's even worse is that these Pokemon also have the Abra Syndrome, as I like to call it. So unless you got a speedy Pokemon with mean look or can put them to sleep, they'll run away in the first turn they get. However, by Generation 2, Game Freak can improve the gameplay and fix a number of the issues in Generation 1. I love all the Pokemon games. I may like some more than others, but that's to be expected. If it wasn't for these 2 generations of Pokemon, there wouldn't be a Pokemon series. Generation 1 laid the groundwork and Gen 2 refined it. It was even stated that Generation 2 was set to be the last generation. But as you guys can already tell, since we have the 20th anniversary, that is not the case. But next time on Game Chain...
Shit.